I was 24 and drifting through the neon-slick humidity of New Orleans when I took the gig at a greasy spoon called the Gumbo Pot. It was a narrow, claustrophobic joint that smelled of burnt roux and old floor wax, catering to the ghosts and the drunks who haunted the French Quarter at 3 in the morning. The food was mediocre on its best days, but we stayed open 24 hours a day, which meant we were the only lighthouse in a sea of bad decisions. I worked the graveyard shift alone. I liked the solitude. Slapping together bowls of spicy stew didn't require much brain power, and when the street went quiet, I could sit on a milk crate in the back and lose myself in a paperback. That Tuesday started like any other. I clocked in at 9, relieving the day manager who looked like he'd been chewed up and spit out by the humidity. There was nothing on the checklist, no special prep, just a long crawl toward sunrise. By midnight, the few patrons I'd had drifted back into the darkness. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the hum of the industrial fridge. I was perched on my crate, scrolling through my phone, when the bell above the front door gave a sharp, metallic chime. I stood up and wiped my palms on my apron, moving toward the dining area. But when I rounded the corner, the room was a tomb. The ceiling fan creaked overhead, stirring the stagnant air, but the tables were empty. I looked left, then right, feeling a small, nervous smile twitch at the corner of my mouth. I figured my mind was just playing back sounds expected to hear. I went back to the kitchen, dismissing it as a phantom noise. 15 minutes passed. Then the bell shrieked again. This time there was no video playing, no music to muffle it. It was real. I marched to the front, my heart thumping a jagged rhythm against my ribs. Empty. I pushed the door open and stuck my head out into the humid night. The sidewalk was a desolate stretch of cracked concrete. No pedestrians. No cars idling in the lot. Just the flickering streetlights and the smell of rain. I rattled the door, trying to see if a gust of wind could trigger the sensor, but it held firm. A cold prickle of unease crawled up my spine, but I forced myself back to the kitchen. Between 2 and 3 in the morning, the world usually dies, and I figured the building was just settling in some weird, mechanical way. When the bell rang a third time, I didn't get up. I sat there, straining to hear the scuff of a shoe or the rustle of a jacket. Nothing. Hello? I called out, my voice sounding thin and brittle. Is someone there? The silence that followed was worse than a scream. I went back to my phone, though the words on the screen no longer made sense. By 4 in the morning, it was time to prep for the morning rush. I walked to the front counter to count the drawer. As I clicked through the bills, a heavy, oppressive sensation settled over me. It felt like eyes were boring into the back of my neck. I kept glancing at the darkened windows and then back at the kitchen door, my skin crawling with the certainty that I wasn't alone. Then I heard it, a heavy, deliberate thud on the linoleum behind me, the sound of a boot hitting the floor. I spun around, the air vanishing from my lungs, as if I'd been punched. A man stood 6 feet away. He was draped in tattered black rags, a hood pulled low enough to shadow everything but a pair of eyes that looked like scorched holes in a sheet. They were bloodshot, vibrating with a frantic, jagged energy. He wasn't just high, he was gone, in his left hand. He gripped a kitchen knife. His knuckles were white, the skin stretched tight over bone. I froze, my pulse hammering in my ears like a funeral drum. He didn't move. He just stared with a 1,000-yard squint that suggested he was looking right through my soul. Look, I stammered, raising my trembling hands. Take the money. Just take the till and let me walk out of here. I won't call anyone. He didn't blink. He just stood there in that terrifying, frozen stance. The counter was L-shaped, and to get to the exit, I had to move toward it before I could swing around to the door. He was too close. If I ran, he'd gut me before I reached the handle. In a moment of pure, panicked instinct, I vaulted over the high counter. It was a clumsy, desperate move, and I hit the floor on the other side with a bone-jarring thud. The man erupted into motion. He let out a low, guttural hiss and lunged. I scrambled to my feet, the bell screaming as I tore the front door open. I heard him hit the pavement behind me, the sound of his boots rhythmic and relentless. I didn't head for my car. It was tucked in the back alley, a dead end. I sprinted toward the main road, my lungs burning, waiting for the cold bite of steel in my back. But after a block, the footsteps faded. I reached a gas station and dialed the police with shaking fingers. They arrived within minutes, but he was a ghost. When we returned to the gumbo pot, the interior looked like it had been hit by a hurricane. Tables were overturned, the gumbo vats were smashed, and the walls were slashed. Outside, my car had been marked. He'd used that knife to carve deep, jagged lines into the driver's side door. The police figured he'd been watching me through the glass for hours, using the front door as a lure to see how I'd react before slipping into the back during one of my trips to the front. He'd probably been crouching in the shadows of the pantry for an entire hour while I sat just feet away. I don't know why he picked me. I don't know if he's still out there, carving his way through the dark. I quit that week and never looked back. I've had this speech impediment since I was a small boy, a cruel stutter that ties my tongue in knots. It gets exponentially worse whenever I am weary or wound up, which made working the midnight shift delivering Chinese food a daily trial. But I desperately needed the money. Speech therapy costs a king's ransom, and every spare dime my parents had was going toward keeping my sister in college. Most customers were understanding. They waited patiently while I wrestled my words out. Some were brittle and impatient. A few were openly scornful. I had developed a thick hide for the usual meanness. What I was not prepared for was a chilling experience that unfolded one Thursday night last November. The delivery order arrived around 10:30. A massive combination platter of General Tso's chicken and vegetable spring rolls, headed for 847 Maple Street. I had never been to that desolate fringe of the city before. It was one of those properties where the pavement ends and the light pollution dies, giving way to absolute, suffocating darkness. I pulled up around 11 p.m. The house itself was an old, faded two-story structure, slightly slumped and in disrepair. A single bulb cast a sickly yellow light in the ground floor window. I grabbed the bags and walked onto the porch. A woman in a floral dressing gown answered after the second rap. She looked to be in her 40s. Her smile was far too expansive, stretched unnaturally wide, as if she had been pressed against the door, waiting. "Oh, marvelous," she declared. "You've arrived. Please, come right in. I have to fetch my pocketbook." I should have stopped her. Our policy strictly forbade entering a client's home, but she was already retreating into the shadows of the house, and I was taught to follow simple instructions. I took one step inside. The smell was immediate and overwhelming. It was a vile, sweet decay, like neglected meat left out in the summer heat. It made my eyes water. Sorry, I managed trying to breathe through my mouth. I see Siken wait on the pee-pee porch. She paused, turning back to study me from my head to my shoes. A strange look of sorrow crossed her features before the smile returned. "Oh, you have a struggle with your speech? That must be exceedingly difficult, especially with your occupation." "It's fine," I said, trying to stand taller. "I'm in therapy." "How wonderful. You will be better soon. I just know it. Let me locate a truly handsome gratuity for you. You deserve it for being so dedicated." She disappeared deeper into the house. I stayed anchored near the doorway, counting the seconds. The stench was nearly unbearable. I desperately hoped it was just old garbage or septic problems. A brilliant flash suddenly blinded me. I blinked spots out my vision. She was standing on the staircase with a retro Polaroid camera, giggling softly. "Forgive me," she said, clutching the device. "I simply adore taking mementos of my kind visitors. You have such an honest face." "I already have to go," I insisted, my pulse hammering. "Of course, dear. Just a moment for your payment." She came down, setting the developing photograph on a small wooden stand by the stairs, then disappeared into the rear of the house. I was paralyzed. I should have fled then and there, leaving the warm bags on the floor. Instead, I stood watching the Polaroid image slowly materialize on the stand. My own wide-eyed, terrified face stared back at me. She returned with a thick roll of bills. "Here you are, darling. $50. That should go a long way toward your sessions." I took the money with a shaking hand, managing a barely audible thanks. I turned to make my escape, but she caught my wrist, Her grip was startlingly powerful. "You know what's rather amusing?" she said, and the cheerfulness had been scraped from her voice, leaving it flat and cold. "My husband also had that little lisp. JJ just like you." Tears suddenly gushed down her cheeks, though the awful smile remained fixed on her mouth. "I'm sorry. I really need to LL leave. He abandoned me last month. He claimed I was too possessive." She was mimicking my impediment now, a cruel, sing-song mockery. "But he never actually departed. He is still here." She tightened her hold, her nails digging into my skin. "He's in the subterranean space. Would you like to be introduced to him? He's very docile now." She was laughing and sobbing simultaneously. The sound was a hideous collision that made my insides revolt. I wrenched my arm free so violently that she stumbled backward. I didn't glance back. I sprinted out the door and tore across the lawn to my car. My hands were trembling so badly I jammed the key into the ignition twice before it caught. As I sped away, I saw her standing framed in the open doorway, still laughing and waving a hand in farewell. I drove directly to the restaurant and told my supervisor I was done for the night. He took one look at my pale, sweating face and made no objection. I never contacted the police. What could I report? A peculiar woman gave me a generous tip, said some unsettling things, and the house smelled bad. They would have dismissed me as an overreactor. But 3 days later, it covered the evening news. A woman at 827 Maple Street had been detained after nearby residents complained about the unbearable, sickly odor emanating from the premises. They found her husband's remains in the cellar. He had been dead for over 4 weeks. The reporter displayed her mugshot, and my breath caught painfully in my chest. It was her. The article explained she had suffered a complete psychological breakdown after her husband attempted to separate from her. She had struck him with a heavy lamp, killing him, and then simply refused to process his death. She continued her daily routine, talking to him, bringing meals, holding full, bizarre conversations with the corpse. Detectives noted she had been ordering takeout frequently, but she consistently made the delivery personnel wait outside. I was the only outsider who had been invited past the doorway in weeks. They found my developing photograph among her morbid collection, alongside others from months prior, from when she used to permit people inside more often, before the odor had become overwhelming. The investigators estimated that if I had followed her downstairs at night, there was a high probability I would not have made it back out alive. I resigned from the delivery job that week. My supervisor understood my decision completely. I am still haunted by recurring sharp nightmares. The sickly sweet odor, the combination of her tears and that cold, unnatural laugh, and the thought of how terrifyingly close I came to go with her when she invited me to the cellar. The $50 bill remains hidden in my bedside drawer. I have never spent it. I cannot bring myself to even touch it. It happened 2 years ago. On a night, I was called in last minute to cover the graveyard shift at a 7-Eleven. Someone had called out, so I worked from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m. The store sat along a busy road, surrounded by fields and quiet back streets, rural enough that the silence pressed in once the traffic thinned. On most nights, maybe 10 to 20 people stopped by for beer, cigarettes, or snacks. That night felt different from the start. Sometime after midnight, a man walked in. He looked to be in his mid-20s. Almost immediately, he began making loud, unnatural noises. Not words, just raw, strange sound that echoed off the shelves. I assumed he had a mental disability. My brother does, so I felt an instant pull of sympathy instead of fear. The man approached the counter, without buying anything. His head faced me, but his eyes were locked upward, staring at the ceiling tiles like he was watching something crawl above us. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I tried to speak to him calmly, asking if he needed help, if he was waiting for someone. He only responded with louder noises. I glanced outside again and again, expecting to see a car or someone waiting for him. The parking lot was empty. No headlights. No movement. He must have walked there. He stood at the counter far too long, eyes still fixed upward, voice rising and falling in those same awful sounds. Eventually, just to make him leave, I handed him a bag of chips and told him he could go. At the same time, I searched for a number to call for assistance, someone who could help him safely. Before I could do anything, he turned around and walked out. I felt terrible for him, but relief washed over me too. Still, the unease lingered. About an hour later, the phone on the counter rang. When I answered, I froze. On the other end was that same voice. The same loud, wordless yelling. I told myself it had to be a prank and hung up, but the store suddenly felt too open, too exposed. I watched the windows constantly, half expecting him to appear outside. When my replacement finally arrived at 4, I left without looking back. At home, I dropped my keys on the table and barely had time to breathe before my phone rang. Who calls at 4 a.m.? My hands shook as I answered. It was him again. The same sounds, closer somehow, more intentional. I slammed the phone down and spent the rest of the night sitting awake in the dark, convinced I was being watched. Even with the blinds closed, I heard faint noises moving through the house. I did not sleep until sunrise. Weeks passed and the memory faded. I convinced myself it had been stress, paranoia, coincidence. Then one afternoon, I went down to my basement for the first time in a while. Papers were scattered across the floor. When I opened the closet, my blood ran cold. Written on the wall in black Sharpie were the words 7-Eleven, followed by the store's address. Beneath it was my home address. On the floor sat several kitchen knives and a large pocket knife, neatly arranged. That was when I understood. What I thought was a harmless encounter, then a prank, had been something far worse. Someone had been living in my basement. For how long, I still do not know. I am grateful that, for reasons I will never understand, he left. I have never seen or heard from him again. All I know is this. That man was not just unwell. He was dangerous.